do you find yourself, and this is because I find that you do this, shifting what I guess I'd call the register of your voice? There's a poem in Fuel called One Boy Told Me, I think it's called, which is a poem that makes me feel like I'm about 9 years old in the best possible way. And then 4 or 5 pages later, there's a poem called, I think, The Vases of Hebron, which is a completely other kind of poem. They're so they're living in the same neighborhood. And they're entirely different registers of voice and emotional intensity. Do you do the same kind of thing inside a week? How?
Well, yeah, I think you could do the same kind of thing inside a week. And One Boy Told Me is completely a found poem. And our son was 2 and 3 when he said all the things in that poem. And I've given him the royalties for that one poem because shockingly, it's been on a lot of standardized tests, which he finds just the most preposterous thing in the world. Why would this be on a high school standardized test when it was uttered by a 2 and 3-year-old? And I was just the selector. So of course he gets, anytime that's printed on the test, he gets the check, and sometimes it's a good one. And so that has fascinated him. How could, and he says, but Mom, it's really your poem because you heard me say those things, and I don't remember saying any of them, and you wrote them down, so it's really your poem. And I said, no, it's not. I was just the secretary, and you were the voice. Whereas Hebron, which is responding to news, and horrific news, and written out of fury, and I would say that's a whole group of poems in my life, the poems that are written out of news that is bigger than we are, news that makes us angry, the problems we can't solve in the world, the violence that continues, and you feel called upon to respond to it, to utter a response to it, even though you know it's not going to solve it, it's not going to cure it. But it's a completely different impulse.
On that subject, could you talk a little bit about, for the 500th dead Palestinian, I'm going to massacre the name, Ibtisam?
Yeah.
Ibtisam Bozia.
Bozia, yeah. Ibtisam Bozia, right.
And in a way, this is kind of a BS question. I apologize for that right off the bat, but and if you read this poem tomorrow, I think it would be absolutely clear to everybody. But what I'm curious about is the nature of a poem that is a poem of bereavement and enormous sadness, but also a poem of what some people would call a very pointed sort of political focus.
Yeah.
That not only, well, for example, in the poem, the gun that kills this person, this 500th dead Palestinian, is never actually placed in anyone's hands. It's as though the gun exists all by itself, outside of human agency.
Right.
And that's in itself a kind of political statement. So I'm just wondering about how you approach those kinds of things. You mentioned fury.
Fury, anger,
but something else has got to
and
come.
Sorrow, and incredible sorrow for the wastefulness of so much violence always, and, my father was a newspaper journalist, and so we were, as children, he called us to a certain kind of attention to the newspaper that I think did not exist in most households. I mean, he would urge us, like in my case, because I really liked grammar and spelling and things, he would say, if you find an error in the newspaper, I want you to circle it, cut it out, and put it at my place, the breakfast table. And he would take it back to the newspaper and show it to the copy editor and say, hey, my kid sent this. So, that calls, you're suddenly riveted, like, oh my God, I have to check up on the newspaper. So, but he also was very disturbed by journalism, although he was a journalist, by all that is not told, all that is left out of every story, and how every story is this little nugget of factual information, the who, what, why, all that of journalism, and yet there's this whole scene, this whole context, the whole backstory that many stories don't give. And he would say, ask the question, what was left out of the story? Who are they quoting and who are they not quoting? And so a story like that one, the 500th dead Palestinian, that was during like the first Intifada, I had noticed how, Palestinian people were just basically as ever, ticked off as if they're just like, you know, nothing on the roulette board of humanity. Tick it off, tick it off. And when it's the 500th, we'll tell you her name, and we'll tell you who she was and what she wanted to do. But then the 502nd will just go back to being a number. And so I was just disgusted by that. And it was the kind of thing that might not have caught my attention as a child, but by the time, you know, I'm an older person reading these regular daily reports, and they're always on the back page, and, you know, that's not an important person. As a poet, I have to write about them and write something toward them, and it has to be a direct address. And, you know, the fact that I have kind of depersonalized the gun, I think there's a whole consciousness, a whole inequity of, you know, how much lives weigh. Well, if you live here, your life weighs this much. If you live over here on the side of a line or a wall or in a different territory, your life weighs this much. And so here's this depersonalized gun, and who's supporting it? Probably we are, the American taxpayers. But, you know, that comes up in other poems maybe, we're paying, or maybe essays. I've found that actually easier to write about in essays than in poems. But I have to say something. I have to speak to this girl. I have to identify her as a person. I am haunted by her. The fact that she was in the village next to the village where my beloved Palestinian grandmother moved to live after she lost her home in 1948 was just kind of immaterial, so that's not really in the poem where she was exactly. But I could picture the spot, and I could also identify with her because I have a really, really clear, I know without a doubt that had I not had an American passport and lived in this country, I would have been killed long, long ago for talking out, because I did talk out when I lived there, and I could never stay quiet even when my father would beg me to. You know, I do not address the soldier in front of the pharmacy when you go in to pick up a new comb. Do not talk to him. I'm going to talk to him. Do not talk to him. You know, so we have this ongoing battle, the two of us. It's not worth it to talk to him, but I'm angry that he's there. And, you know, so that was like a lifelong thing. So I'll talk to her, because I feel I could be her.
Well, it is also said that Habibi, your novel, which gets marketed, whatever that means, as a young adult novel. I've never quite figured that out, but it's a marketing
For junior high kids.
Well, but it's a beautiful story.
Thanks.
And it's also said to be, you know, if you do internet research, semi-autobiographical.
Yeah, they say semi-autobiographical, just because I moved to Jerusalem at the same age as my main character did. But I don't think of her, I never did think of her as me. I thought of her as a fictional character, and, you know, I've always been interested in that line too, and interested in some of you talking about it with your poems. This came up sometimes today. How often is the narrator in your poem you? Or is it someone just that you know very well, or someone who's living an experience similar to the life you've lived, or someone whose life you observed who lived down the street, whom you can imagine, but you're speaking of it now as if it's your life. So I needed to feel that she was another person whom I knew very well. And, you know, a few things she saw and did are things I saw and did. And I put her in the school where I went because I felt it was important to describe a school the way it really exists to this day. But she was a fictional character.
I've got, I think, just one more question, and I want to see if any of you have questions. So I was taught, this is a long time ago, I was taught, and I sort of resist these dichotomies anyway, but years ago I was taught this, that there are two kinds of poems essentially, you know, that kind of statement. And they are poems of celebration and poems of lamentation, which is to say the poem that celebrates or the poem that elegizes.
Wow.
And I've often, because I was taught that by somebody I love, I've always felt great attachment to it, and a simultaneous belief in it, and a simultaneous conviction that it's not true, that it can't be true. That they're
Why?
Well, because sometimes the boundaries of those things wander. Sometimes
Yeah.
they cross over, and it becomes impossible to see exactly where the celebration stops and the lamentation begins. They start looking the same. I mean, have you ever, because
Yeah,
I
I think
go
that-
through your books, I mean, I can look at a book like 19 Varieties of Gazelle, and there's a line in there, how's it go? There is no gazelle in today's headline. This goes back to your father's journalism. But in a way, and it's speaking of the beauty of the gazelles, I believe you're in Bahrain, in a nature preserve, and there are all these different kinds of gazelles, but there's something about immediately pulling in the newspaper headline that turns the gazelle into this, from this celebratory symbol, into something else by virtue of its absence in the headline.
Right,
So
right,
that's,
right.
I guess, what I'm talking
Yeah.
about. So, I mean, have you ever felt that dichotomy, or resisted that dichotomy?
But like you, I feel that there's often a blurring of that boundary between them, and that, how could you lament something if you weren't also celebrating its being, or loving the fact that it had existed? Or I think of the William Stafford poem, Evening News, where he watches the news and then he goes to the sink and feels water reel on his hand, and then he goes to the backyard and he speaks to the grass. I love how in his poems he was often speaking to the grass, and he says, oh please help everything go deep again. And so that he's lamenting the fact that he just saw a newscast which seems very, very, surface, like surface depth in its coverage of events, but he has this relationship with water and with grass where he can go and invoke, kind of a healing, or remind me who we are, remind me where we are, and it has to be together in the poem. I mean, unless you could feel both of them, how could you lament? So I think it's very true that those elements are present in so many poems, but I think they're mutually present and simultaneously present. Or that recent Merwin poem where he talks about maybe there's only one time after all, and like maybe now in his older age, he's really still in that same time of youth and possibility, and that it's all blurring. It's kind of like two times in life that are moving toward this complete communion with one another. And while there is a sense of all the time that's behind me now and the time I won't see again, there's also this presence of early time, and like he's recognizing it. But my oldness was present in my youth is present now, which I certainly can identify with.
How about, well,
Okay.
before I say, turn the floor, is there anything I haven't asked that you would have liked me to ask?
No, I love what you ask. They're the kinds of questions I'll no doubt be thinking about for months to come, and coming up with better answers. As we talked in one session today about Stafford's favorite assignment, he said was, think of something you said, now write what you wish you had said. And I felt someone was doing that in their poem, like writing a conversation again in a beautiful way. No, I love your questions, and I love how they embrace like a person's experience and possibility. And one thing I really appreciate about having written for so long is that your life always feels so rich. And just to walk into your local bookstore down here and look around and instantly see 20 books you haven't read and feel rich, like there's always so much there. Or I have a book from 1935 on my bed that was in the house where I'm staying that I'm going to read a story in tonight. And in the preface it says, Alexander Woolcott says, I have never bought more copies of a single book than The Little Boy by a Danish writer, and I'm so proud that I've been allowed to include it in this anthology. His book is like this thick, 1935 edition, and just that feeling of richness that it's waiting for me to read, and I have no earthly idea what it's about, who the little boy is. That feeling that our lives are filled with these continual discoveries of voices who will give us something we cannot predict. Yeah. So.
How about questions out here?
Yep.
Karen, right up front.
Many of us are thrilled to be here, and as you've mentioned, with the having the opportunity to be in a writing program and you know, working with Bob and Alexandra and having you here, of course, is quite the thrill. And
I salute your wisdom for being here.
I mean, you have to get accepted.
I know, but I think you picked a very good place to apply to.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
But I was curious, you know, I'm sitting here sort of savoring this whole thing, and you got to spend so much time with Bill. I'm just kind of curious. I was on the phone with Sam.
Oregonian.
Right.
I was on the phone with Sam, and he was asking me what the big takeaway was today from meeting you. And so I'm just kind of curious if you could
That's a
share.
dangerous question.
I
Yeah.
know, it was
Yeah.
hard to answer, but
Yeah.
I'm sort of curious if, like, you have a secret best takeaway from Stafford that
From William Stafford?
that maybe I wouldn't find
Yeah.
in, you know, when I'm reading an essay.
Well, you know, when he would have a gathering like this, I mean, I had a chance to be in many occasions where, I mean, I was not his student at Lewis and Clark. I did not go to school there, so people think I did, but I did not. But to get to sit in a session, a one-time only session, many in the state of Washington or Oregon, but some in Texas, different places in the country, some at Notre Dame, different places, he would often say to a group, I want to know your considerations. Every person in here has something that is drawing you to this room. What is your magnetic pull? Why are you here? What is your relationship with your own work? What trouble are you having now with your own work? So there was that great, I always found that so incredibly generous. I mean, he wasn't there to tell us what his considerations about poetry were, but what are yours? What are you worried about right now? What do you think may not be working out? And sometimes when people would bravely put their consideration out there, he would just sit and listen and nod and say something like, that's really something to think about, isn't it? And he wouldn't answer it at all. I think he did not have a compulsion to solve things. And I think that was a genius of Stafford. And when you read his poems and you read his quote, aphorisms, his wise sayings, you know, he believed in his every morning. I just kind of learned this from Kim this year, too. I never heard Kim quite describe it in this way, but in his every morning daily writing, he would write down details like that happened within the last 24 hours, things he didn't want to regret, as simple as what the eggs looked like on the plate at some diner he had stopped at. But then he would also write wise sayings that had occurred to him within the last 24 hours. And you have to be pretty humble to do that. You know, I mean, just to, you know, put down these pronouncements that sound as if, you know, the early dark has told me this, or the 12 degrees understands what it's like to something. You know, there's a bravery and a humility in that kind of pronouncement, and but he didn't feel compelled to solve people's problems. If you said, I'm really worried about such and such, he'd say, good luck with that. And I remember that night when we met at the Library of Congress. I don't think I had ever had a literary trauma to that point as great as deciding what two poems to read. Because we had to turn them in advance, like a month in advance, and they were going to put the names of our two poems in the program. And so to decide, you know, what two poems do I read at this event? I've never read at the Library of Congress before, and it's much harder to read two poems than to read 10, because then you have a better chance of maybe hitting it with one, if somebody might like it. But, so to pick two poems, well, William Stafford said to me that night, was it hard for you to pick the two poems for tonight? And I hadn't read them yet. And I said, oh, it was really traumatic. And he said, well, you should have asked me. I could have picked them in a second. But here's my big failure. I didn't ask him. Which two would you have picked? I had no idea. And so I went away from that night feeling, what an idiot. Not only did I not ask him, but even when he opened the door for my asking him, I still didn't ask him. But there was something so non-directive about his presence. It was sort of like, I have faith in you, and you will figure this out. And I have faith in us as human beings, you know, our own imaginations, our own body of experience, whatever it is, you know, if you believe in it, if you keep following it, if you write regularly and invite many things to the page, you will figure it out. You will figure out what you most need to say. So that humility and that willingness to to listen so deeply. I mean, that was, I don't think I've ever met a person who seemed like a better listener than he was. And it's interesting then when you read books like Kim Stafford's book Early Morning or 100 Tricks Any Boy Can Do, to see how he was as a dad. Because of course our dads and are not the same people to other people that they are to us. So, you know.
Another question.
Humility.
Max?
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hello, thank you for coming to University of Idaho.
Thank
I'm
you.
here in the program attempting to write fiction. I, however, love to read poetry
Yeah.
and read a lot. And
Yeah.
however, I often come across poems that just seem like I can't enter them, like they're inaccessible. And I was wondering, as a poet, does that ever happen to you? And how then do you enter?
Yeah.
How do you negotiate? How do you make it accessible? I guess that's my question.
Well, sometimes you don't. And you just, you know, I think, okay, I could say this out loud and it might be, and it's delicious on the tongue and I have no earthly idea what it's talking about. No idea at all. Like reading in a language that you don't speak and just liking the way the syllables sound and imagining the way you're supposed to pronounce this. And yeah, and in fact, it comes up a lot with some of my friends who get the poem a day, you know, from the Academy of American
Right,
Poets. And,
yeah.
And some of them will have this like little circular conversation like, where are we now? What is this, please? You know, is anyone of you for following this? You know, and it'll be interesting because I feel like the others get mad when they aren't on the path with that poem. But I don't get mad. I feel like I read it and I kind of revel in the fact that there's a lot out there that I don't understand. And I enjoy that. It's a pleasure to me. Why do I have to understand everything? What a burden. The things I do understand are perplexing enough. You know, I understand that violence leads to more violence. And who has that helped? You know, it's not solving anything, but you know, so I kind of revel in a poem that I think, well, is this like a play with sound? Is this a wild dream? Is this a hallucinogenic experience? What is this? You know, I have no earthly idea, but if I read it tomorrow, and many times I'll print up the poems from, say, Poem a Day that I don't quite grasp because I want to read them tomorrow. I want to read them another day and think about them. And, you know, I don't think we should feel a compulsion to understand everything. But I do think we should keep looking and looking to find the voices we fall in love with. I think that's really important. And when you talked about, you know, that sense of celebration and lamentation, the mentor poet who said that to you, or the mentor poets for each one of us, you know, we know how important it is to have that chord of meaning in their poems that we can go back to over and over again and keep finding something resonant and keep finding something new. But no, I don't think we have to understand every poem. And recently I heard the poet Arthur Z, a Chinese-American poet who lives in New Mexico and who translates from the Chinese a lot. He gave a little talk about a Danish poet, I think her name is Christensen, Inga Christensen, whom he's really fallen in love with recently, her work. And it all started like someone mentioned her to him at a party and said, you seem like a person who would really love her work, and he didn't know it at all, so he went and found it. And he said, when I first read it, it felt like an alphabet exercise to me. Like, here's somebody who's taking an alphabet and playing, like everything was sort of stretching and exercising with an alphabet, with sound. But the more I read it, he said, I have been drawn into her spell. And he said, he was talking about why we should all read poems that we feel at first are somewhat mysterious, from a world we may not quite understand, but there's something alluring about them. And we can taste them in our mouths when we say them, even if we couldn't intellectualize or negotiate why we are attracted to them. And he said, the more I read Christensen, the more I feel like she's coming to belong to me, and her language is starting to infuse my language. And he was urging people to read, people in translation, poets in translation, whom we, were not that accustomed with even their country of origin. Didn't know that much about the body of literature in that country, but for whatever reason we were drawn to the work, so.
Thank you.
Does anyone in this room love Harriet Mullen, Sleeping with the Dictionary? I think there's a great example of a book. And Harriet, I've known her for almost 40 years. She used to live in Texas, and we actually were thrown into some classrooms together when we were very young. Like, here's a bunch of rowdy junior high students, deal with them together. And here we were too. She was a very narrative poet in the beginning, writing out of her own experience, and then changed into much more language-based, experimental kind of poet. But that book, Sleeping with the Dictionary, is, I think, a truly great American book of poems, and was a finalist both for National Book Award and National Book Critics Circle Award, which is rare that a book is finalist for both. But I think it stimulates a reader to just look at language in all kinds of new ways. And I was shocked when it took a group of students to show me, even though I'd read the book multiple times and felt like I was in love with it by now, I didn't even realize a certain device she was using, like with every letter of the alphabet. That had never even occurred to me. So just to keep finding new windows into work, new playful ways to think about it. But I don't think you have to love every poem or understand every poem.
Good luck.
Yeah.
Anybody else? I can't see anything.
I know, I
except
can't see a
occasional
thing
faces.
out there. It's like it's
5.
It is 5?
Oh, it's 5? I
Okay.
apologize for my
Well, if there were
run-on
one
sentences.
more question, we'd subject Naomi to it.
Or I could read a Stafford to close. I have a Stafford here. Let me do that. Let me read that. Thank you again for inviting me to your wonderful program and place. And here's the book that came out this year to celebrate Stafford's 100th year centennial. Ask Me 100 Essential Poems. I don't know how they ever picked 100, since there are so many essential poems. But when did you first start reading him? Can you remember?
Well, it was in graduate school because Dick Hugo,
Yeah.
there were poets Dick Hugo insisted you read.
Yeah.
And he would test you on it. Did you read that poem? Yeah. Tell me about it. And Stafford was one of those.
Yeah. And I like the fact that Stafford was often go somewhere that his other poems didn't seem to go. So I'll read this one that's always seemed to me like a rather strange Stafford poem. It's not my favorite, but I like it, and I like the device he uses in it. And by the way, this is a device I would suggest using in your daily writing when you feel all dried up, or at a loss, or empty, or exhausted, or sick of yourself, whatever. Just ask yourself a question and answer it. A catechism. Who challenged my soldier mother? Nobody. Who kept house for her and fended off the world? My father. Who suffered most from her oppressions? My sister. Who went out into the world to right its wrongs? My sister. Who became bitter when the world didn't listen? My sister. Who challenged my soldier sister? Nobody. Who grew up and saw all this and recorded it and kept wondering how to solve it, but couldn't? Guess who? That's a weird Stafford poem.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very weird. It's a very unlike, and I love the fact that it's considered as an essential and that he himself liked it, and I heard him read it many times. I mean, there's something about it that's so, you could be 7 years old and write that poem. You could be 12 years old and wonder about the material in that poem. And you could be a later age and still admire it, respect it.
And it breaks the fundamental rules, where are your images?
Yeah. And like asking yourself questions, interviewing yourself, well, you can do that on the worst day. And it'll really help sometimes. I think interviewing yourself or interviewing some extra self or some early self, I think interviewing your earlier self or your future self can be a very interesting tactic in a notebook. You know, just keep doing that on a regular basis and see where you get. Bob, I can't thank you enough. You are such an amazing poet. I value your work, your spirit here. I really appreciate getting to come to this wonderful place, and thank you all for listening to me. I just hope something has been useful, and I hope to see some of you tomorrow night.
Tomorrow night, 7:30, Boston.